Welcome back to another episode of Pragmatic Optimists. I'm attorney Rachel Cohen. I'm joined by Rhode Island State Senator Tiara Mack. And today we are also hosting Palestinian writer and law student Ahmad Ibsais. And he's going to be talking to us about updates on the ground in Palestine, which unfortunately I do think has fallen out of the American consciousness a little bit. So we wanted to spend some time this week discussing with you the reality of the situation on the ground for people in Palestine, additional research and kind of documentation of genocide that's coming out. And we're going to get into all of that today. So, welcome. Is there anything that we want to focus on specifically? I know we're going to talk a lot about the ceasefire today. Tell us about that. Would we call that a ceasefire, do you think?
Yeah, there's a common phrase that whenever there's a ceasefire, Palestinians cease firing and Israel keeps firing. And I think that's the perfect embodiment of what we're seeing. Israel is still testing new weapons and destroying infrastructure in Gaza. Over 200 people have been killed since the ceasefire went into effect, and there's been over 100 documented violations of the ceasefire so far. So how we're still calling it a ceasefire, I don't know, because the firing has never ceased, but alas, here we are. So today I thought it'd be interesting to talk about the specific ways in which the genocide has been carried out, which we haven't really seen before in genocide scholarship, which has been the specific targeting of women and children as a method to bring about, the elimination of the Palestinian people. So I think maybe just to start off, we can give like the very basic introduction of like how genocide is looked at in international law. If that works with you. So genocide is taken out usually or observed in 5 different prongs. First, it's the killing of the group, causing bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about the group's destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and then forcibly transferring children into another group. So typically genocide, just like any type of crime or murder, you would say, looking even domestically, it's an actus reus, what is the act, and then the mens rea, which is like the mental component or what is the intent. And genocide carries something different than other crimes against humanity, like ethnic cleansing or apartheid. For genocide, there's a specific intent or a special intent that has to be there, and that's usually inferred by, or not inferred, but you can see it through the perpetrator's actions, or it's implied through what their words are. And there's no specific like threshold for how many people have to be killed. Of course, in Gaza, the numbers are there anyways, but even if it's 5 people, that would perhaps constitute it if a court ever looked at what the perpetrators' intents were. So in Gaza, just like starting off with members of the group, documented at least 60,000 people have been killed, but independent estimates like the Lancet and other medical journals estimate that over or at least 200,000 people have been murdered between the physical violence of like bombs and blasts, or being trapped under rubble, starvation, disease, etc. And the Israeli military own report shows that at least 83% of those killed were civilians, and those numbers are usually less because Israel considers like teenage boys as like insurgents in some way. So
any teenage boy?
usually it's
What's
like
the kind of
16 and
standard?
up. They might consider as there's been cases where like 12-year-olds have been considered like military targets, like valid
And
military targets.
just inherently off of them being in a specific place and of that
Yes.
age and gender.
Yeah, or like if one of their parents or uncles or older cousins is, part of a group and they're in like the same house, everybody in the house will be considered a legitimate target.
I want to be really clear for our viewers, and then Tiara, I want to hear your question too. But one of the things that we want to be focused on in this conversation, we want your attention to be on Palestine, on other places around the world where US imperialist funding of other countries, whether that's the UAE, whether that's Israel, are leading to mass murder. But I also want you to be thinking about connections to what we see in the United States. And that kind of guilt by association for me is immediately reminiscent of things like gang databases in the United States, where if you are a Black man or a Latino man and you hang out in certain places and with certain people, you can be subject to increased surveillance if you wear certain colors and you're kind of guilty by association in this way. Tiara and I talk all the time about the violence that we allow for people in places like Palestine comes for us eventually. And I think it's important to draw those connections. But Tiara, I also cut you off. Keep us going. I'm learning a lot from this. Y'all know I'm not an
We're
international.
also Cop City. They train from the Israeli forces, right? And a lot of like the drone technology that's being tested in Palestine, especially also in the West Bank, in Hebron or Khalil. If you ever look it up online, it's like considered the most surveilled place in the world, and you can't walk 2 steps without like a security camera or drone footage. And even outside the Damascus gates in Jerusalem, uh, they put up some type of like AI surveillance system that tracks people's like biometrics and scans their faces and stuff. And they saw that like the amount of Palestine protests that were in that area actually decreased after they put those up because people were being arrested later on, just because of the amount of surveillance that was happening. So yeah, sorry, your question.
No, this is super fascinating, and I think my question is centered on what does the official charges of genocide now? How does that change the way that we speak about what's happening in Palestine and in the global context? Because since for 2 years we have watched this massacre unfold on social media, we've seen reports, we've heard the horror stories, we've seen people literally calling for intervention at the international level, and now that we now have these official reports of genocide, what changes, especially because we know the U.S. has a heavy hand and heavy involvement in overseeing the ceasefire. There's now reports that Trump is the chair of overseeing the current ceasefire plan and has a heavy hand in wanting to reshape, redevelop, whatever that means. It's going to become Gaza Riviera. So, how does the official charge and these official reports change how not only scholars are talking about it, but how we as a country should be holding our government accountable to these charges that we are fully complicit in funding in? And what should someone who's not a scholar of genocide be thinking about how we now hold our elected leaders accountable, hold our corporations accountable, but also really think about what this means for the US in the global context?
Yeah. Okay. So a few
Lots of
points there.
questions there.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest critiques of international law is that it's completely reactive, and we've seen that with every mass atrocity and genocide. Right? International law is never going to stop a genocide, and I think maybe the hope with the law is that it might one day provide a way for reparations or rebuilding in a way that's dignified to the population that was, or their attempted erasure. Right? Like it didn't stop in Rwanda, even though they sent a peacekeeping force. In Serbia, some people argue that it actually exacerbated the genocide because they were just able to carry out like a slower strangulation until it stopped. In Yugoslavia, yeah, that was Yugoslavia. Same thing. Obviously, international law didn't stop, and of course, genocide scholarship mostly came after the Holocaust, so it wasn't really there to do anything to help the Jews that were impacted by the Nazi horrors and evils. Right. So that's like the first critique, just like generally of international law. And still yet, like you mentioned, 2 years, no claim has actually succeeded on the genocide claim. South Africa introduced it and it was joined by, I think, 20 other countries. I might be wrong on that fact. But it was joined by another slew of countries. And all the International Court of Justice said that it was plausible, right? And the International Court of Justice is different than the International Criminal Court, which was the people that were delivering the warrants for Netanyahu, which we've still seen no country has acted on, right? And I think that's why the law is only as powerful as the people willing to enforce it. And so far, nobody is willing to enforce it or stand up against some of the greatest powers in the world, which are the United States and Israel, teamed up with the evils of the UAE and then all of the other Western countries that want to join in these mass atrocities all over the world. So I think for common people is one, just to recognize that the law can only go so far and we have to use it in the way that it's meant for and make those like small arguments where we can and those small wins where we can. Just looking domestically, there's been a lot of small wins as it comes to like free speech, right? The Trump administration and the Biden administration really tried to censor the pro-Palestine movements over like the last 6 or 7 years, starting from 2021 and with like the Sheikh Jarrah movements, and like that was like maybe the first like big Palestine protests that we've seen in a while. So it's not just Trump. But recently, the courts have been ruling in favor of Palestine protesters, Mahmoud Khalil, and then some of the other student protesters. Even in Michigan, these student protesters from the University of Michigan, 7 out of the 11 of them succeeded in their cases. And the courts, pretty much across all of them, have been saying like the government is misusing their power in constricting free speech on political grounds, and not actually to like the content of their speech. So I think that's how we have to use the law, is like in these small incremental wins, which is I think on the international scale, we have to realize what works are like mass sanctions or mass mobilizations. What we saw in Italy when dock workers like completely shut down their ports and like were able to actually stop weapon shipments, like that's what we have to be doing everywhere. And I don't think in the United States we've reached that level of like political awakening yet, where like we're taking to the streets in that way. I think a lot of the times we just go out in the streets and we get these numbers. Like No Kings saw hundreds of thousands, and I didn't see like the material impact of that yet. Like there wasn't. We were in the streets protesting, but there wasn't like a direct like chain of action that we were supposed to take. At least at like our local ones here. I'm sure at other places they maybe have been more organized, but
I think in general that is a national critique of No Kings. And I think that we are constantly talking about that, is that we're really excited to see people mobilizing, but let's think about how we do that critically. And I think it all comes back to this notion of what's happening in Palestine, how we as Americans with a lot of power in the global stage, too much perhaps, respond to what's happening in Palestine doesn't just impact there, but international relations, international law, and our own society. And so I want to leave us here because I think that was such a fantastic summary of kind of international law and everything else. But we are going to have one more episode with Ahmad. We're going to talk about specifically targeting of women and children in Palestine and what that means from a legal perspective and how that connects back to the United States. So keep following along, like, subscribe, share. We're here on Legal AF on the Midas Touch Network, and we'll see you soon.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.